it has been named as the largest displacement crisis in the world, the largest humanitarian crisis in recorded history. I think in the impact on the community here in Montreal and in Quebec has been incredibly difficult. A lot of people in our community have unfortunately lost loved ones, family members, friends, and so the impact emotionally has been incredibly difficult. Financially has been incredibly difficult because of course the financial toll of the war has pretty much fallen on the diaspora. The humanitarian aid, unfortunately, has been extremely narrow.
Sudan's war has been going on now for 2 years and 2 weeks. Over 15 million people have been displaced, and 30 million people, over half the population, face acute food insecurity. Human rights violations are rampant, and the civil war is very much ongoing and seems to be getting worse. Yesterday, the Sudan Solidarity Collective organized a community benefit for Sudan at La Sala Rosa, and it was a gathering of community members to raise money specifically for humanitarian efforts in Sudan, but it was also a educational event. So I'm joined here by Aude Simon, who was there, and yeah, Aude, thanks for joining.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Drew, for inviting me to speak about what I've been covering lately.
Yeah. So Aude, can you tell us a bit about what this event was like last night, and what kinds of things were you hearing?
So the event started in the evening. There was, I would say, over 100 people, maybe even 200 people even had to sit on the floor because it was actually packed. So this event centered different artists, different people. It was basically almost I would say, it was a benefit concert, almost a benefit art event where people read poetry, their poetry that had to do with either Sudan or just, more so anti-colonialism sentiments. People sang as well. There were tables where people were, again, since it was a fundraiser, selling art, selling books about Sudan, selling anything cultural tied to Sudan. It was honestly, I was not expecting it to be that packed for a Sunday evening, but it was a lot, like a lot of people. And I would say that again, the goal of the event, as I talked with many of the people there, was really to raise awareness about what's going on in Sudan, specifically since like it hasn't really been talked about, or at least the people who are doing the most work are people from the diaspora, and instead of saying what's going on in news media, and stuff like that, so people would just they've been like, the community here in Montreal has been really kind of um, supporting Sudan and doing most of the work. And this is something that's been told to me many, many times by people that I've interviewed in the past couple of months, but also just talked to in general. So yeah.
Great. Well, thanks for that summary. I'm curious, what are some of these? What are you hearing from these organizers? What are the sort of main preoccupations in terms of their organizing efforts on the ground in Montreal? And I guess, could you maybe also describe the Sudanese sort of diaspora in Montreal?
So I wouldn't exactly be able to tell you about the exact numbers, but I know that Montreal hosts a very large Sudanese population. Most people are either like here or in Ontario. So it's been quite disheartening for a lot of people that I've talked to here to see the treatment of Sudanese people fleeing the war, but also just in general, families here trying to reunite with their family members fleeing the war, or just having support from the government. And then in terms of what has been said, it's like, also we have to know that what's going on in Sudan currently is historically has been labeled as the largest displacement crisis in the world. As you said, there's 15 million people that have been displaced, 12 million which are internally displaced, and it's also one of the worst humanitarian crises as well. People are facing famine. There's cholera outbreaks, malaria as well. People don't have access. Like 80% of the health system has been has fallen. People have a hard time having access to electricity. It's just very much like it is a big humanitarian crisis, and yet the aid is very minimal from different people in government. And again, like one thing that I've heard a lot from people at events that I've gone to, whether it be protests or the one that I went to last night, or just talking with friends of mine that are Sudanese, it's that all of the efforts to help the Sudanese community falls onto the diaspora here or, well, outside of Sudan, not anyone else. So it's a lot to bear on your shoulders. Yesterday, I was talking to Daha El Mardi, who's one of the members, organizers of the Sudan Solidarity Collective, which was one of the main organizers of the event yesterday. And what she was telling me is that it's very difficult for the community to see what's going on. As you said yourself, Drew, it's been 2 years and 2 weeks. So 2 years and 2 weeks for a war that has erupted is a very, very long time to go without proper support, let it be governmental or just like international in general. So a lot of people, one thing she told me is that a lot of people here have lost loved ones, be it family members, be it friends, be it people that they knew. A lot of people have also been injured. People are missing. There's people that have been captured, that have been kidnapped. So there's a lot of people missing, partly due to the RSF capturing people. And it also has been very financially difficult for people in Sudan, but also for people here to actually support their family members or their close ones. The government hasn't really made it easy for people to be able to send money. So the way that they had to organize themselves was to raise money and be able to send it to organizations that are back in Sudan. So that they can then use that money to help people. So it's really person to person contact. There's nothing like, I would say, there's no support that's like official. It's really the diaspora themselves, once again, that are doing what they can to help. I know that yesterday, the event before I got there had already raised close to $2,000. And part of it had already right away be sent to organizations back in Sudan, because it's that much of a pressing matter, right? We're talking about life and death. So that's one thing that was told to me by Doha. So the event wasn't only to raise money, but it was also in honor of the martyrs, people who have died, people who have disappeared, and also in resistance, and also to talk about the history of struggle that Sudan has faced, with not only the war but the Bashir regime as well, everything that's been going on, revolutions, counter revolutions. So it was really about honoring people, but also to a certain extent educating people on what's going on. It was a way to keep people informed on ways to support Sudan. And let people know how and where they can engage. I know that Doha also told me that they're going to be doing a few workshops in May as well to have people be educated on the subject. Because once again, people are not aware of what's going on in Sudan. There's nothing talked about. Even Doha herself told me that most of the people who talk about Sudan are either Sudanese people or news outlet where it's in Arabic, so people don't know where to go search information. So with that, organizing events like this make them able to give people that information, and for them to be able to even go in their own communities and talk about what's going on in Sudan and raise awareness. So yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on that sort of one of the first things you mentioned there. You have a situation like Sudan, which is just by all measures just an absolutely catastrophic humanitarian crisis. And then and it's a war, and then you have but the response to that versus something like Ukraine or also just catastrophic disasters is very different in terms of the show of solidarity, and the prioritization within the government. and policy. And I guess I just wanted to hear a little more, like, yeah, what do people sort of attribute that to?
People definitely feel left out. That's been a big talk, especially with the IRCC program, so the Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada government section. Yeah, people are feeling left out, and I know that with the discussions that I've had with members of the community is that it's partly seen as anti-Black racism and anti-immigration sentiments, and I think that's a very interesting thing that has been said, because I've heard it a lot and a lot, where people feel that because people have this tendency to see kind of like Black countries, especially Africa. Well, Africa is a continent, but Black spaces, states, as kind of like always unruly, or where there's always kind of like it's always unstable, people care less. And that's also one thing that we've seen with how Sudan was actually talked about in the very, very beginning. Sudan was actually talked about when there was actually diplomats and foreigners in the country. And then as soon as those people were out, then it was, okay, well, the rest of the people can fend for themselves, which is, again, why is it that Black people are often left behind to fend for themselves and not receiving the same support? And I think that's what also, as you mentioned, is one of the things that that like hurts people the most, because with Ukraine we've seen so much solidarity, we've seen so much people support people coming here. But I know that when I talk to the Sudanese Canadian Association of Quebec, that's one thing that they mentioned in one of their letter actually to Mark Miller, where they felt there was disparity of support for Sudanese immigrant, even though, like, there's a good amount of Sudanese people here in Montreal, in Quebec. So people just feel like it's a lack of care for Black lives. It's a lack of care for immigrants. It's a lack of care for people who don't look like what people assume Quebecers to look like. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess the context there is that Trudeau announced pretty significant cuts to immigration numbers back in October, and that's obviously still in effect. So on the one hand, there's sort of a reduction in the number of refugees overall that can come in, but it seems like the number of refugees that's allowed from Sudan is also very low.
Yeah, it's actually very minimal. So basically, the program to accept immigrants or Sudanese refugees here um, started in February 2024, which is once again like a year after the war had broke out, which is kind of like, we can dispute how it's kind of a long time. And I know like programs take some time to get implemented, but it's kind of still a long time to get people to come here, right? A war, so much people die in a year. So much people can die. So much people can, flee to other neighboring countries, which has been done in Sudan. People have gone to Chad, to Egypt, to other neighboring countries. So a year was kind of, in my opinion, it was kind of like a slow start to helping people. And last time when I talked about this, I think it was in February or maybe a bit before, the cap was close to 3,000 people to come to Canada. That's what we have to understand, not to Quebec, to Canada, because Quebec at that time had opted out of the program, saying that the way they were helping was that they were, helping Canada accept people here, which doesn't really, mean anything, to be honest. Because Canada, well, although you're in Canada, Canada still is not you. And now the cap has recently been increased to 5,000, and 500 people can apply, could apply, because it was closed. The application was closed on April 18th. It gave people about a month and a half, a bit over a month, to apply to come to Quebec. So 500 people were accepted were accepted to apply to come to Quebec. I haven't had news on how this went yet, since it was just like 10 days ago, and we're still kind of like trying to see how things went. But even then I know that in an interview, one of the organizers in Montreal mentioned how 500 people is not enough, especially since all in all, 500 people, yes, it's easy to see the application saying 500 application. Okay, that's the start. But the thing is, like, how the process of the application is actually not well supported, because the thing is you also have to submit biometrics information. So your prints, for example, there's a lot of paper to fill, and the thing is, right now with the war, a lot of people don't have electricity. So how are you able? And you're fleeing war, right? You're. It's not. You're not necessarily living your day-to-day life. So it hasn't, the support hasn't been what it should have been. And while saying like 500 people can apply to try and come to Quebec, the thing is support should go further than just that, because once again, as I said, like no electricity, for example. How are people supposed to apply if they don't have the support from the government to do so?
Yeah, I mean, and just doing some back of the napkin math here. I mean, 5,000 people out of like 15 million displaced
Yeah,
is it's not
it's
it's
nothing.
I mean it's very far from being a fraction of like 1%. It's like
Yeah.
it's a completely it's I mean it's a let's be honest, a completely symbolic number. But I wanted to get a bit into the so just looking it up here, Egypt is hosting the largest number of Sudanese refugees with 1.2 million. And then South Sudan has 850,000 and Chad has 414,000. So those are the sort of relative numbers when you talk about like Canada accepting 5,000 Sudanese refugees. I mean, obviously, we're dealing with a big backlash and sort of anti-immigrant sentiment.
I do want to say that first of all, the 5,000 cap that was raised. First of all, it was raised after a lot of backlash and a lot of protests by the Sudanese community. So at first, it was not going to be even a thing. As I said, it was like they keep slowly raising it, but nothing big. So it's just like it's actually the community pushing for the government to listen and allow them to have more people come in. But I have the number somewhere for Sudan, because the Sudanese Canadian Association of Quebec actually wrote a letter to Mark Miller calling him out for the lack of fairness directed towards the Sudanese community and Sudanese refugees trying to come here. In their letter, they talked about how many Haitians were accepted, how many Ukrainians were accepted. I can try and find a letter right now. Actually, I have access to it. And they had asked people if they were able to send this email to Mark Miller to pressure him to actually raise the cap and actually provide real support, financial, healthcare, being able to find housing as well when you come here. Just because, again, there was a big disparity. So the letter, I have it. Yeah, in stark contrast, there's a part, I don't know if it's okay if I read it, but that was a few months ago, so the numbers have changed a little bit. But they were saying that there was discriminatory treatment of African Sudanese refugees compared to other groups. They said that Ukrainians faced no cap on permanent residency applications and were eligible for a one-time payment of $3,000 per adult and $1,500 per child under the government of Canada. Um, Afghan refugees were granted 40,000 spaces along with financial assistance for housing, food, and essential needs. Colombian, Haitian, and Venezuelan refugees received 3 months of financial support upon arrival and had their biometrics and permanent residency fees waived. And Palestinian refugees from Gaza have been provided financial assistance to support their relocation and settlement. While in contrast, Sudanese refugees were subjected to a restrictive cap of just 3,250 applications. That was a few months back before it was raised. It was raised in February, I think. A fraction of what was offered to other groups. They received no financial aid despite fleeing one of the world's most pressing humanitarian crises. This is in stark contrast to other humanitarian programs where refugees have been provided with supports to help them settle and rebuild their lives in Canada. And they were left with no functional biometric center, creating additional barriers to their applications. The absence of a functioning biometric center in Sudan has, as mentioned above, has left many applicants stuck in the initial stages of the process, meaning that they cannot fulfill their application. So they're asking for the government to not be as discriminatory towards Sudanese refugees as other people benefited from more support. So that was one of the letters that was actually sent to that they wrote in February 2025, and that was sent to Mark Miller. Yeah.
Yeah, so I found the number of Ukrainian refugees that have been allowed into Canada just during the sort of period of the Russian invasion, and that's 298,128. So just under 300,000 relative to the 1,000 per year cap. And also this apparently the Sudanese diaspora in Canada in 2021 was about 17,000 people, but probably significantly more than that at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah, so part of the prioritization in terms of Ukraine is that you have this really clear narrative where it's like, okay, there's the the enemy, Russia has invaded, and people are, and Ukraine needs our help. Obviously, the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada is pretty significant, has been mobilized as well. And I'm not questioning the need to do that at all, at least in terms of accepting refugees. But with Sudan, and I think later in the week we're going to talk about Haiti. You have, I think, a very racialized sort of narrative where it's like, whereas there's a clear opponent, there's a clear sort of narrative, there's a clear sort of heroes and villains kind of thing going on, and victims. Narrative in Sudan, you have a situation where I think it very easily falls into a narrative of, oh, this is a dysfunctional African country. And we might be able to occasionally sort of glance at the fact that like colonialism created a lot of those sort of divisions and sort of economic crises and wealth disparities and all that. But mostly we just sort of, I think the media coverage sort of stops there and says like, okay, this is a dysfunctional country. It's horrible and tragic, but we don't examine our role in it. We don't examine, and we don't have another narrative that we can put on it that says, okay, this is why we need to be in solidarity with people. The hopelessness is sort of built in structurally to the narrative. And so, yeah, I guess I just wanted to hear what you're hearing about that from the people you're talking to. How are people sort of negotiating that, I guess, discursive terrain in terms of how the sort of popular imagination understand, in Canada, and specifically sort of white settler Canada, understands that crisis.
Yeah, so I think that for this, there's so many important points to go towards, because I think that even you saying there's no villain in this story, because it's true, there's no obvious villains, but there are actual villains. But people don't, because it's so much more easier to see it as, for example, Ukraine vs Russia, right? It's just straightforward and everything. But as you said, for when it comes to countries like Sudan, you have to look at the history of Sudan, and then you have to actually acknowledge the different players that impacted the state of Sudan, what led to where we are today, right? Which would ask of many countries, to face their own partaking in, well, I don't want to say, like, I don't want to curse, but they're partaking into kind of ruining the state of many countries, right? People are not, as you said, colonialism, people are not ready to have this discussion. They don't want to say, oh, well, in the past we have done this, because then if they do have to do this, they also have to give support, or even, give financial aid.
Reparations, yeah.
Yeah, reparations, exactly. Thank you. I was looking for the word. So people are not ready for that, right? And I think that one thing we can say as well is that, for example, right, like when we talk about the war in Sudan, there's two main parties that we think about, which is the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, and the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces. And the RSF is often like framed as the bad guys, and this is something that people from Sudanese communities have told me, is that it's not the RSF vs versus the SAF. Like both are actually really bad. They don't have uh, the civil they don't have civilians' well-being at their core of actions, right? They're just trying to profit off of something. And the thing is, like, even as we're saying there's no villains either, but the RSF is actually backed by the United Arab Emirates. So there are actual outside players that also have an impact on what's going on, which is what people are ignoring. So the United Arab Emirates are funding and arming the RSF. And also, like, there's also an issue of land and resources, for example, where many countries are actually benefiting from what's going on in Sudan because they will be able to get land, they will be able to get resources such as gold, and countries like Russia, actually, Egypt, Iran, all benefit from that. So there are actual villains in the story that are very clearly talked about by Sudanese community, but I think it's not as people don't actually delve into the history of what's going on and why people want these things. That they just want one answer, like a one thing where it's like, as you said, like Russia versus Ukraine, which is easy. It's just like, oh, well, Russia is doing this to Ukraine. We can move on. It's clear, right? But telling them what's going on in Sudan would ask of them to actually delve into the history and delve into colonialism, which people don't want to face, and also just note how many players are actually um, exploiting people in Sudan and the civilians. So I think there's that. That's really that makes it really that is which is why people um, separate themselves from what is going on in Sudan. And I think one thing we can say as well is that news-wise, that's also a big problem. People don't know. People don't want to go look, but they also don't know where to go look to learn about what's going on in Sudan. So if they're not being explicitly told by news media, they're just going to ignore and tell themselves that, oh well, this is just what's going on, but I'm not seeing really information about it. I don't really care about it. Nobody's telling me who I'm supposed to hate. Nobody's telling me, what's going on in an easy way. So, and again, the fact that like the push story, as you said yourself, about how African countries, Black countries, are always going through some sort of disruption, some sort of like instability, also does not help. So there's no news media, like news outlet, that are actually rectifying this information about, except for people from that specific diaspora. So I think that's also some of the reasons why um, people are finding it so hard to actually look into it and understand that actually there are villains. You just need to actually do the research and look into it a bit more. They want the answers given to them, and unfortunately, that doesn't help into the kind of narrative of like who should we hate and why.
Yeah, absolutely. And to come back to, I guess, one of your earlier points, the United Arab Emirates, obviously one of the key backers of the RSF, one of the combatants in the civil war, which is obviously creating just absolute massive humanitarian catastrophe. Canada has a formal defense agreement with the UAE. They signed an agreement recently in 20 to make sure that the weapons industry has access to the UAE's defense spending market, and has formal military cooperation with the UAE. I mean, I think probably most recently, the UAE has used Sudanese fighters from the RSF to contribute to Yemen's civil war, which obviously was another humanitarian, just absolute catastrophe. Which and that civil war is obviously ongoing. So all these things are connected. I guess I wanted to ask you about the a bit more about the media coverage, because it seems like there are sort of democratic forces, like people who want like a to strengthen democratic institutions in Sudan, and not to be ruled by one sort of military dictatorship or another, and obviously want sort of peace to break out. Did you get any sort of hint at who the actors in Sudan are that people should be sort of paying attention to or allying with? Because my sense from the media coverage is that it's just like, oh, there's a with Ukraine just to draw out the sort of contrast, you get a cast of characters, but then you also have these sort of cast of you highlight specific people who are actors on the ground who become these sort of avatars for the good guys or the bad guys in that narrative. But I'm curious, are the Sudan Solidarity Collective, are they sort of pointing to people on the ground in Sudan who we should be paying attention to and listening to?
I do want to say, like, first of all, like, I haven't had any name drop to me specifically, but I think it's mainly because they were focusing on like how to actually have international help, the organizations that are trying to help on the ground. But I do want to say before we get into that, one thing that someone told me yesterday as well is that they're not a big fan of the way the war is currently seen as a civil war. They said it shouldn't actually be seen as a civil war because it's a counter-revolutionary war where with the Bashir regime that was overthrown in 2019, people were expecting kind of Sudan to become a democratized state. And then instead, like the militia and the military kind of took over, right? So that's one thing Doha, who I was talking about, was telling me. She was saying that's one of the biggest misconception, one of the biggest narrative that people are pushing when it shouldn't be pushed. And what she said actually is like, she said it's a war that is afraid of what the revolution brought in, which is the idea that Sudan is a democratized state, a civilian state rather than a military one. Any form of that is a threat to foreign power. So I just wanted to kind of like point it out, uh, as this is something that when I asked her yesterday what one of the main narrative that she finds is being pushed and shouldn't be, this is what she had to say. In terms of
Sorry, I just want to pick up on that point. I just pulling up an article here from Jacobin magazine. That's basically, the headline is "Blame South Sudan's Civil War on Elites, Not Ethnic Tensions." In ethnic tensions, this is in quotes. So what I see from sort of governments is that they say, okay, well, these ethnic groups are fighting over here, and we're doing our best to, like, I think the Canadian sort of government, and this is very much the rhetoric, right? It's like, oh, these ethnic groups are fighting, and we're doing our best to sort of develop democracy, but at a certain point, our help is not not being used or whatever. Whereas I think this is painting a maybe it's not easy to sort of enter into that, but saying, okay, well, there's actually the people who had sort of a democratic uprising, who are now being pressed by sort of competing elites, basically trying to like grab authoritarian control over different territories and make deals with whether it's the UAE or Russia or whoever else in terms of solidifying their interests and their access to land and mineral resources and so on. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how the Canadian stance of trying to support democracy, how the Solidarity Collective is viewing that stance.
I think I will say that the best person to talk to would be Doha, because I think she has amazing stuff to say. She has been interviewed a lot, and she's very happy to like bring more information to that. But from I know that, like, not factually speaking, but I know that in the way that we see civil war, it would technically be considered a civil war by the way things are seen. But I think from what I understand, and I hope I'm not misspeaking, the way Doha was framing this is more so that, like, it's actually like the war in itself is just, yeah, there are two groups fighting for power for sure. That's like a fact. But in itself, that's all to kind of like push against the way the civilians are trying to have a more democratic state, right? Or trying to, um, I'm trying to express myself better because I feel like maybe I'm not doing this as well as I'm hoping for. But it's just like, like when the Bashir regime was overthrown, people were, as I said earlier, people were hoping that they would, that like gave people hope of like finally like we're gonna have a more so democratic state, right? So it feels like the war was kind of like counter to that. It's counter to that. It's to keep, I wouldn't say keep people in check, but kind of like go against the main grain of like finally we can like have things different. So I think it's not so that like if you look at the two parties, yeah, two parties are fighting, but it's more so that like the problem is not like the focus should not be on the two parties fighting, right? It should be on the fact that the two parties are fighting to keep kind of the civilization, the Sudanese civilians, out of being able to get back their power and have Sudan becoming a democratized state. I don't know if that makes sense, if I'm expressing myself right, or I don't know
No,
if.
no, it totally makes sense, and I think this is the story of a lot of a lot of wars, if not, to some extent, all wars, where you have, obviously, if the people who are going to die in a war are different from the people who are sending them there, um, you uh,
No, it's a
there's
really good way of.
there's something to gain for the person sending those people to die, and it could be any number of things, but certainly in this case it seems to be that they're fighting over sort of resources, but they also gain, um the, it's a kind of a win-win proposition for them, from a really cynical perspective, for the people who are actually giving the orders to continue the war, in the sense that, yeah, when you have a war, any sense of like developing civil society or developing freedom of speech or the ability to sort of have democratic rights goes out the window because there's a war, and violence. It privileges violence. Whereas if you have peacetime and there's a certain amount of social sanction against using violence, then the different standards apply. And so, yeah, there is a very sort of cynical. It sounds what it sounds like. What's happening in Sudan is that there's a very cynical sort of power grab happening. Um,
Mhm,
um,
exactly.
yeah, I'd love to hear a bit more about, I guess, how you see this playing out sort of going forward. What are the Sudan Solidarity Collective, what are their hopes, what, just or from the different, actors who are present in that event last night, what are people sort of hoping will happen in the future? How are people hoping that we can sort of take a next step in, and collectively holding solidarity for Sudan, and not just having that fall on the shoulders of this, relatively small diaspora?
Yeah. So that's exactly as you said. Um, they're calling. That's why they're organizing so much in Montreal, right? Organizing protests, organizing fundraisers and stuff like that to be able to. They're calling on to the international scene, if I can say that, to actually understand what's going on in Sudan and stop, you know, um, kind of stop their anti-black racism and anti-immigrant sentiments to help people who are in need. I know that a lot of people have also mentioned too, as well, a big problem is to also actually, which we've seen so many times in different countries as well, going through war or any type of disruption, political disruption, right? Um, how can I collaborating with the actual diaspora, right? That's one of the best ways of then the diaspora of the country in which there's issues is never talked to, um is never, I don't know what the word is, but um like, well, talked to, never like called on to like speak about the problem. So this is something that I know has been talked about a lot, like listen to actual Sudanese people. um and I guess, like, unfortunately, it's kind of hard to talk about next steps because it's an issue that's such like that's seen from such a far lens, if I can say, that I don't know how to. I feel like we would need a leap to kind of like get to the next steps, but I know that like what I was told was really like they would love for people to actually listen to them and actually go to Sudanese people, like follow Sudanese people and groups who talk about it on social medias. Go to the source, collaborate with Sudanese people. And yeah, that's mainly what I heard in terms of what they hope for the next steps to be.
And is there a sort of a starter pack for to use the blue sky term for people who would like to understand what's going on from a Sudanese perspective?
Oh, yeah. The thing is, like, it's as we talked about, it's really hard because nobody's talking about it except them, right? So it's really, follow people from the Sudanese community, go to events, go to workshops. They're doing so many things to actually teach people about what's going on and actually bring in international solidarity. But people are not necessarily tuning in. But yeah, do follow, like, the Sudan Solidarity Collective, for example, is uh, such a great account to follow. They organize so many events. There's literally an organization called Montreal for Sudan. There's this person also called Beeson Blast, who's literally doing live on a regular basis about what's going on in Sudan. She recently did a live on the 2 years mark of the war in Sudan. There's also the Sudan Canadian Association of Quebec as well, that's been organizing stuff. And I feel one thing I would like to mention as well is that the Sudanese community in Montreal has also been collaborating with the Palestinian community in Montreal as well, to try and kind of give each other a momentum to be able to raise awareness about both of these places' situation. So I feel like if people kind of tune in into what's going on in the world, especially um, you know outside of Canada and Montreal, they'll be able to actually, like, the information is actually right there, just that people are not seeking it. They might not be news like media, but people have been raising awareness, have been organizing events, have been talking online, and going to, for example, like, the workshops are going to be to talk about against colonialism, but also Black resistance, talk about Black resistance, while also talking about Palestine as well. So, like, if you literally, like, I feel like people who are for the causes of others should be able to find that information. It's really just like it's really there, actually. Just people are not really tuning in, unfortunately. But to follow, like, try and, like, actually follow Sudanese activists who have been talking on their own social medias and have been organizing across Canada. Um, yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like there's some really really good resources there. I think there's a lot more to discuss, but I think we'll leave it there for now, and hopefully we'll have more coverage of the sort of as things unfold of how the Sudanese diaspora is reacting, and hopefully increasingly how the rest of Canadian civil society is reacting. Thank you so much for this reporting, Aude.
Thank you so much, Drew.